signs of intensive Egyptian preparations.
It seemed like the people who got our reports were somewhat indifferent. We saw massive troop movements moving into positions, infantry along the canal. There was also quite heavy movements of semi-trailers moving into a position west of us that appeared to be a missile site. Everything we reported in over the field telephones, the response was always, we've heard that already. If you hear anything relevant, please talk to us.
As the solemn day began, there were intelligence reports saying that Egypt and Syria would attack at 6 p.m. that day. David El-Azhar, the Army Chief of Staff, suggested an immediate and full mobilization of reserves and a preemptive strike, but Moshe Dayan, the Minister of Defense, overruled him and authorized only a partial call-up.
A few minutes before the shells started falling, we were given very quick warning to go into the shelters that we had. And then, as I remember it now, all hell broke loose. It was like the sky was falling in on us. We were some 21 men altogether facing thousands. Their infantry started crossing the canal. One of our officers managed to sink 4 of them. From the very beginning, the feeling was almost one of hopelessness because we realized how few we were and against how many we had to stand.
All of a sudden, we felt that we were actually caught unprepared and something terrible was actually happening.
Torn from their families at a moment's notice, men ran to join their units at the front.
They let us surrender. On the way to one of their military cars, I believe it was a Jeep there where they took us, I saw some of our men they were lying in a pile. The Egyptians had evidently gathered them up. There were dead lying everywhere. It was like a slaughterhouse.
During the day, 50 Israeli planes had been lost to SAM missiles. We had suffered a terrible blow, and our string of supposedly impregnable forts along the Suez Canal were virtually overrun. The unthinkable had happened. We seemed to be facing catastrophic defeat. The succeeding days brought no respite. On October the 9th, in a disastrous counterattack, we lost 250 tanks, most of them victims of the new Soviet anti-tank missiles. By night, another 20,000 Egyptians had crossed and were 3 miles inland. In northern Israel, the story was similar. Here on the barren heights, a huge Syrian force faced less than 300 of our soldiers and a few tanks. When the Syrians cracked through in 2 sections, all our northern villages and towns lay exposed. On the home front, everyone was trying to help the war effort. By this time, early complacency had been replaced by shock at our losses. And I shall never forget the pain at seeing, for the first time in my life, Israeli prisoners of war on television. With battles on 2 fronts, our situation was very grave. In Sinai, the Egyptians were widening their bridgehead across the canal. No Arab forces had ever won such victories against Israel. As if these complications were not enough, we were in very urgent need of arms to replenish our great losses in planes and tanks.
It was the first time that we were told that Israel might require resupply while military operations were still going on. In other words, that the war would last longer than anyone had led us to believe.
There was no doubt in my mind, no doubt in Henry Kissinger's mind as to what we should do. Israel had to be saved. Well, there were some in the Defense Department that thought that we could have the airlift, but do it in such a low-key way. First, they we're going to have Israeli planes come in, paint off the Star of David, and have them deliver it. And I said, no way you're going to do that. That isn't going to work. It's going to be found out. So we skipped that one. And finally, I said, it's got to be done by American planes. And I remember that Henry Kissinger, after negotiated with the Defense Department, and said, we have a plan. We will send 3 C-5As. And I said, well, 3 doesn't seem like very many. I said, how many do we have? He said, well, I don't know. I think about 25. I said, send all 25. He said, but the Defense Department people believe that if we send 25, that's more than the traffic will bear politically. And I said, look, I'll take care of the politics. We'll get blamed just as much for 3 as if we send 25. I said, I want you to send everything that can fly.
It took us 48 hours. So by Friday evening, the full airlift of the United States was at the service of resupply of Israel.
5 days into the war, our condition was better in the north. At one point, our forces had been reduced to 6 tanks. When they were reinforced by 2 armored divisions and counterattacked, the results were devastating. In horrendous onslaughts, the Syrians lost nearly 1,000 tanks. Their army that had come with pride and lightning now lay smashed and ruined on the Golan Hills, leaving our forces within artillery range of Damascus. But in the south, we were still in peril. On October the 14th, the Egyptian armor attacked towards the Sinai passes. In the half-day inferno of battle, over 300 Egyptian tanks were destroyed. For Israel, the tide was turning. A day later, Israel went on to the attack, using a plan devised by General Sharon. Taking advantage of a gap between the Egyptian forces, Israeli commandos now crossed the canal to the western side on rubber boats. Within 2 days, our forces were 16 miles into Egypt. The objective of the action was to create a major Israeli bridgehead. By the time the Egyptians woke up to what was happening, their forces west of the canal had been decimated. Now, in panic, Sadat and his Soviet backers rushed to consult with Kissinger.
Then on Friday, Brezhnev invited me to come to Moscow to negotiations on a ceasefire. I had told the Israelis all during that last week that the maximum time we would be able to delay would be 48 hours after there was a formal request for a ceasefire, and that they should have their military operations in a shape in which they could implement that judgment.
The ceasefire was called for October the 22nd. In the north, Syria had been totally driven out of the Golan Heights. In the south, in spite of the ceasefire call, skirmishes continued till Israel had surrounded the Egyptian Third Army and cut off its supplies. That was when Sadat panicked and asked for a joint United States-Soviet force to police the ceasefire. When Kissinger said no, the Soviet reaction was violent. Their airborne divisions would rescue the surrounding Egyptian army.
Then we had a situation where Brezhnev, in a communication, said, in the event that we do not do it together, then the Soviet Union must act alone, unilaterally. We considered that to be a message of the most dangerous implications. And that was why we made the decision, and it was a very difficult decision, but one that was very necessary, that we had to get the message back to Brezhnev that we would not tolerate Soviet unilateral intervention in the Mideast area. And we backed it up by calling an alert, which involved even the possibility of nuclear weapons. So calling the alert, while it was criticized for risking nuclear war, was actually what kept the Soviet Union out and avoided what would have been eventually a nuclear conflict.
The Soviets yielded to American pressure, and the crisis was quickly resolved. A United Nations peace force was sent to supervise the ceasefire. The war had that lasted almost 3 weeks. Its effects were to reverberate for years.